Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. I've gone for one of my Daunts book bags. They are a wonderful book chain. I've gone for Daunts in particular because of their emphasis on travel writing. We're going to be talking a lot about travel and travel writing, and specifically Croatia over the next hour or so. So don't look too closely at the bag. That's a bag for Holland Park, and the travel bookshop is the one in Marylebone, but they're both highly recommended, great places to hang out. And I'm pretty sure, certainly in Marylebone, if you look in the Balkans or Croatia section, there will be a copy of my next guest's book. We will be talking about My Family and Other Enemies. It's by Mary Novakovich, veteran travel writer, award-winning travel writer. And this is a wonderful, rich, dense look at an extraordinary part of the world that I knew absolutely nothing about. So welcome, Mary, into the book bag.
Thank you very much for having me, Suzi. It's wonderful to be here.
It's a delight to have you. So the first thing I want to say really is, we both worked at The Independent, and I was literary editor, and it's kind of the best job in the world. There aren't too many drawbacks if you're a booky person to being a literary editor. But some might say being a travel journalist is pretty amazing. But like all things when you do them for work, maybe the picture is not as rosy as people might like to think. So tell us a little bit about that, how you got into travel journalism. And it is work, isn't it?
It's very much work. The funniest thing is when I get back from, say I'm doing a city guide for an article, and I spend a couple of days having to hit the ground running and have meetings with various tourism people and check out a whole load of hotels, visit about 5 museums in the course of an afternoon, and do all of this. Generally, it's places I've already been to before, so I'm catching up on also what's new and all of that. And I come back and utterly exhausted, and people ask me, so how was your holiday?
Yes.
It's not a holiday. But funny you mentioned The Independent. The only reason I got into travel writing was our very dear, late lamented travel editor of The Independent on Sunday, Jeremy Attia.
Yeah.
And I would be working on travel pieces, subbing copy on the travel desk. And Jeremy loved the Balkans, absolutely loved them. And we would have long chats about travels and things. And he said, you must write for me. And I said, yeah, absolutely would love to. And he gave me my very first travel commission, which, funny enough, wasn't the Balkans. It was Toronto, but there we go. And I never actually did write about the Balkans for Jeremy because he then left to go freelance. And I ended up, I can't remember who the first, I think it was the Telegraph first commissioned me to do Croatia a few years later. But yeah, so it just built up from there. And the subsequent editors of both The Independent on Sunday and The Independent, and also eventually the Telegraph, The Guardian, and other publications. It built from there. And that was, I think, the first thing I did for Jeremy was 1999. So we're going back a bit now.
Yeah, well, again, the great thing about Jeremy and travel writing in particular is that it isn't beach holidays. It isn't just a free beach holiday. It is still, a travel editor once said to me, we are still looking for stories, just like a news journalist is looking for stories. What's new? What's happening? So you have to go and dig out this info, don't you? And often you're sort of on your own.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes I have an enormous amount of help and advice and support and guides who fill me with so much wonderful information, things I wouldn't have known, even though I do swat an awful lot. And also I have a way of going back to favorite countries. And I know the history, especially Croatia. We'll come to that in a moment. But actually, let me say that I was in Croatia last month on the island of Rab, which I've just written about for the Times. It was out in the paper last weekend.
You were tweeting like crazy about this, and I was admiring all your pictures so much.
It was beautiful.
Envious.
Well, they do have all the lovely beaches there, but they also have a couple of fascinating historical sites, one of which is relatively well known, an island called Goliotok, which is what Tito had set up in 1948, where he put his political prisoners on a very barren island and worked some of them to death, and it was a pretty grim episode in old Yugoslav history. And you have boat tours that go and visit, and it's completely, it's grimly fascinating in the sense that all the old barracks and all the buildings, everything was smashed and just left to rot. And there is actually one tour guide who does tell more stories about the inmates and all that sort of thing, but I just had the basic tour and just time constraints, really. And I also happened to notice that there was, I happened to notice on Google Maps, a pin referring to a concentration camp on the island, which, I know Balkan history pretty well. And I also know that during the Second World War, the Italian fascists they'd taken over all of the Adriatic coastal region, and they had set up a camp there, mainly for Slovenians and Croatians, and then eventually Jewish inmates. Although the Jewish people were actually they were sort of interned, as opposed to the Slovenians and the Croats, who were starved to death. And you wouldn't expect that in this beautiful island, which everyone goes there, about the 22 sandy beaches in a country where it's mainly pebbles and rocks. But it's a fascinating. There's more history than Croatia knows what to do with, I think. To some extent.
Yeah. And one of the themes that comes out in this book, well, let's talk about your family connections, because obviously you do have a bit of a head start with Croatia. Not least the language, or languages, perhaps we should say. Well, why is it called My Family and Other Enemies?
Well,
let's start there.
I do love the book My Family and Other Animals. I've always loved it, and anyone at any point who lived in the region of Lika in Croatia, where my family is from, has been an enemy at some point. And I just couldn't resist the pun. It was just staring at me in the face, and I was totally surprised that no one had actually used it before. And that was because my family, they'd suffered terribly in the Second World War, and then came to Britain after the war, and then obviously family, friends, and all people who were still in the region in the 90s war suffered horrifically as well. So that's where the title came from.
And your family are from there. Your father died quite some time ago. So this is a book in which you are reconnecting with family members who've always lived there. And Novakoviches are all over the place. And you have absolutely loads of relatives. But you were also on a little bit of a quest to fill in some gaps, I think, about your father and mother and their early life.
Absolutely, yes. And really, it's one of those things where I always tell everybody now, grab your old people and pump them for information. Get them to tell you all their stories, because they will go very quickly. And my father died in 1989, and he did tell me some stories, especially as the last few months of his life when he was dying from cancer. And I tried to remember everything, but, that was 34 years ago. And
he was an old father, wasn't he?
No, he was 63 when he died. When
right,
I was...
But that's a while ago.
Yeah, I know. Yes, in the sense that, don't forget, I'm in my late 50s. I'm not exactly a young woman. But yes, there was a 9-year gap between my mother and my father. But then my mother is 29 years older than I am. So he was he was 38 when I was born. That wouldn't exactly be an old father now.
Yeah, well, it's just that I was looking at the lovely picture of him. There's a lovely photograph of him. But that's in wartime, so yeah.
And he was barely a teen when he was actually, in 1945 when the war ended, he would have been 19. So yes, and so much of the history died with him, and so many connections with family, and he had an enormous family. But because his mother, my grandmother, she died in 1929. And there's no one alive now who has any memory of her at all. They couldn't. And Even my dad, he was only 3 when she died, so I expect he would have had no memories of her either. And so, but my grandmother came from a family of 10, and that's where I have this enormous collection of Novakovich families all over the place, because they all had huge numbers of family. But my brother came from a family, sorry, my father came from a family of, there were 7 in total, and plus one half brother and then one half step brother. So there's a lot of us, and a lot of my aunts. They seem to marry other Novakovici, so that's why the name Novakovich kept on coming up, because Novakovich is like Smith,
Right.
in certain parts. It's like if you go to Wales, everyone's called Evans or Davis or Williams. Same thing with Novakovich.
Similar sort of thing.
Absolutely.
The other thing that doesn't help is that they all have the same first name as well. The same first names just keep being recycled.
Oh no, I have to. Everyone's called either Milka or Rada or Ilya. I mean, everyone's called Ilya, and Milan and Maria and my name and not many. They weren't very imaginative, really, and it does get confusing when I've had friends say, "Oh, I've absolutely loved your book." It's hard to keep track of who was who. When I said, I know, I did try to do my best saying, the one who, the uncle who did this, or the grandfather who did that, or the great grandfather, whatever. But yeah, they were a little bit unimaginative. They're a very small pool of names to choose from.
Let's talk about the structure of the book. It is structured at about various visits that you've taken over the years, beginning when you're only 11, I think. And there are some very cute pictures of you at that era, actually looking rather sulky, I have to say. Cute, but sulky.
I was such a spoiled little brat. I still apologetic towards my family, who I put them through so much rubbish. I was fish out of water. I was just homesick, and I was very indulged as a child, because I'm the youngest of 3 and the only girl. So you can imagine what I was allowed to get away with. And so I'm shipped off to what was Yugoslavia at the time for the whole summer, and I was just it was totally out of my element. I mean, everything was completely alien to me. I thought I knew the language. I didn't really. A lot of English had crept in by that point, even though my first language was actually Serbian, because my family Serbian from an enclave in Croatia was predominantly Serbian at the time. And the landscapes were alien. Everything was just so mountainous and rustic. I came from a city. It's like, what the fields, mountains? What's all that? And outdoor toilets, earth closets. What on earth is this?
If you're lucky, sometimes not even that.
I know, exactly. Visiting my step grandmother. Where's the outhouse? Out there. Where? Anywhere you like. Okay. Where's the nearest bush there? And it was for an urbanite. It was. I got used to it, obviously, especially kids. Kids are so malleable. Just put them in any situation, they adapt eventually. And but I was a whinger. God, did I complain? Oh, I'd like to think I've grown up since then.
Well, you definitely liked the food more than you did on that first first trip. And food is a huge part of this story. But let's talk about the region. It's a specific place, isn't it? That even has a mountain that's your mountain, and sort of unknown to tourism.
Absolutely.
That's really part of the story as well, isn't it? So tell us about this very special region.
It is. It's called Lika, and it's right in the dead center of Croatia, and it sort of borders Bosnia on the eastern side, and in its current incantation, it's part of Lika Senda County, which actually goes as far as the coast, the Adriatic coast, and close to on its way to Zadar, but the original historical part of Lika is much smaller, and it's mountains, really, more mountains and rivers and canyons and lakes and waterfalls. But the only thing that people would know about Lika is Plitvice Lakes National Park, which is the first national park in what was Yugoslavia. And it's millions of people visit every year. It's one of the biggest tourist sites in Croatia. But people go to Plitvice, they go for a day, and then they go off again. and they know nothing about the rest of the region. If you like science, then you know that Nikola Tesla was born there, and the other big claim to fame, and his birthplace has like a mini industry that's grown up around it, the village where he was born, which is now his old houses museum. They built a visitor centre. His father was the priest in the church next door, and it's an absolutely fascinating place. And kids of all ages love it because they have the Tesla coil, which you can see demonstrated, and you touch it and your hair goes up and all that sort of thing. But the rest of Lika is it's sparsely populated. It's the least populated yet the largest region of Croatia, and all there is to do there. I mean, I was back again in June of this year, and I deliberately visited the other regions that I hadn't known of before. I hadn't visited before. I've only sort of zipped through and didn't really stay. And everyone is making use of all that nature. You know, they're kayaking, they're canyoning, they're whitewater rafting, and hiking and cycling, and all that, because that's pretty much all there is there. I mean, there aren't any cities, or the towns. You know, the largest settlement, the largest town is like 6,000 people. So there's nothing urban about it. But it is, I hate to use the word unspoiled, but it is pretty much that, apart from Plitica.
And is that something that's grown up since you were there as a little girl? Was it completely off the tourist trail back then, or were there hardy hikers occasionally to be seen?
Well, back then, Lika had a much bigger population because, with the planned industries under the communist government, there was a factory in practically every town. They weren't producing, they weren't making any money out of it, but everyone had a job. So you had a lot more people living in the towns, a lot more industry, and a much bigger economy, even if essentially they were living on Marshall Plan and foreign loans, and which is why everything collapsed soon after Tito died. But at the time, yeah, it wasn't as empty as it is now, and there would have been hikers. I mean, there always are. But it's that whole adventure tourism which has been taking off in a big way, and I think it's the best thing for that region. It works really, really well. It'll take a long time for any more over tourism, put it that way, apart from Plitica, which is over touristed.
It is one of the themes of the book, isn't it? That you're often combining kind of work and sort of pleasure, in that you're writing about the region, also investigating your family's roots. But there is this sort of sadness, this nostalgia in a way, because everybody's getting old and your family members are getting old, living in their beautiful little, in the midst of orchards, getting fish out of the lake and all this kind of thing. But the younger people don't necessarily want to live that lifestyle. So there's really that tension in your book, I think, that you're going there and loving it, but also thinking, how long can this last? Absolutely, yes. And it is very sad. In fact, the last 2 times I've been to Liga now, this year, and the last chapter in the book I write in 2019, which was just before the pandemic started. And neither time did I go back to the childhood home, the one that I'd been to as a child in 1976 when I was shipped off there that summer. And really hardly anyone left. So many of my family died since then because they're all, they're in their 80s. And it's sad to go back. I mean, their children, as in people my age, they'll go back in the summer and they'll spend weeks on and off throughout the summer and enjoying all the beautiful things that, that Liga has to offer. But they all live in Belgrade. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't move there permanently because there's no work there, really. And they're not at the age where they'll be retiring soon, but I doubt they'll retire to Liga. They might do, I have no idea. But they'll have the homes to enjoy in the summer. The rest of the time, everything's shuttered and the orchards, a lot of fruit doesn't get picked and, gardens get overgrown. They come back in the spring and start over again.
At least some of the places are still being used, but really purely on a part-time basis.
So in a way, one of the things that you seem to want to do in being an advocate for this area and writing beautifully about this area in journalism and in this book, again, there's that sort of bittersweet thing of if too many people come, it would sort of be ruined. And there are a few passages where you're kind of going, where have all these people come from? It's quite, the balance is hard to strike, isn't it?
It is. One thing, as I do mention in the book, we're in a throng of people in Plitvice, and it's driving me up the wall because it hadn't been like that the previous time I'd been there, because that was 15 years earlier, and it hadn't quite become as big a part of every tourist trail now as it is now, and it really is quite depressing because, as I said, I'm a travel writer. It's my job to find places. I then write about them, tell people to come. They come and do exactly that, and then I get annoyed that they've done exactly that. And I like to share things. I like to share discoveries because people like to know about more interesting places. As I said, I think it'll be a long time before Lika does get overrun. A very, very long time. I know that the pandemic changed a lot of people's mindsets, Croatians' mindsets. People living along the coast, when they were in small flats in a busy town, and they just wanted to be around land. And people from Dalmatia were buying up more properties in Lika, and being there this past summer, there are an awful lot of holiday homes and places to rent. And you start thinking, is it going to be like another Airbnb sort of, hollowed out place? But it's still actually, I'm all for that because they're not supplanting people who'd be living there normally. People who don't really live there have using their old, childhood homes or family homes to turn into holiday homes. So they actually invited people to come and stay. And as certainly said, it's summer, it's a season and everyone's there. So it's still, there's a long way to go with tourism there. And, a couple of pockets, I wouldn't say it's busy, it's just the right sort of note, the right level. The rafters and kayakers who are in the River Gatska, for example, in the sort of the western part of Lika, that's much more defined as a sort of a relatively not touristy, but not really touristy, but a relatively popular place. And there's also Bear Sanctuary, which is quite popular. Again, it's a long, twisting, winding road to get there, and it's not exactly overrun, but it's another thing that people want to go and see. But it's. I don't think that within the next 10 years we need to really worry about Lika getting overrun.
You mentioned the roads. I mean, the state of the roads in some cases that peter out, or they're sheer drops into valleys. You seem to be doing the bulk of the driving. This is when you were travelling with your mum, who sounds lovely, but also a completely maddening companion for you on some of these trips.
My mother and I, we spent 3 weeks there in 2009. That's sort of the central part of the book. And I love her to bits. And the sad thing now is she's got dementia, and it's quite advanced. And she's a very different person from the complete handful that I had. And she, absolute nightmare. I mean, there are times when we had a brilliant time together. Other times when I reverted to adolescence, she would just be this mad woman going completely berserk. And I think, looking back on it, that she might have been in the very, very, very early stages of dementia, just because she was so irrational. I mean, she's always been mad. She's always been completely bonkers and incredibly stubborn. I mean, really, really stubborn. And but I think even for her, she was reacting in ways that were a little bit extreme. But yes, and I was doing all the driving then because she was too old to hire a car abroad. She's only in her 70s, but they've got certain regulations, and it was really hard work. I was driving this little 700cc little Chevrolet Spark, and up and down these winding, twisting mountain roads that as I said would just disappear all of a sudden. and that was hard work. The subsequent trips I did with my husband, and he did all the driving.
Phew.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, let him work. He also sounds as if he's a bit more understanding of your need to work. I mean, there's a kind of comic thread running through where you're thinking, I really have to go and, you know, visit some places to write about. And she's saying, there's this cousin, there's that cousin, that, you know, I want to visit all these. Yeah, she wants to visit all these cousins. And you're thinking, I can't make a travel piece out of you visiting.
That's essentially why. I mean, when I started writing the book after that 2009 trip, you know, it's been that long in development, and I finally finished it last year. And but that was actually going to be the book, and then I discovered very early on that there was not enough material there because she just wouldn't play ball. She insisted on spending, you know, going to visit, you know, 5 or 6 sets of family, friends, and cousins, and any waifs and strays along the way, and it was almost compulsive. It was almost sort of deliberately obstructive in a way. It was quite perverse, and you know, there was one point where we visited like the 6th person that day, and I really wanted to go to see one particular thing in our family story, and she spent the entire visit saying, oh, you know, she's my daughter, she's complaining about me wasting her time. And that's all that she said to this woman during the entire time we were having coffee, rather than actually having a proper conversation. So she was deliberately doing that. And it was really frustrating. I did have a lot of people tell me, though, that they found some of the episodes really, really, really amusing and very, very comical. But said neither of us came out of it well, because I lost my temper so many times, and I just lost patience. I couldn't deal with it most of the time, you know, because I'm also a stubborn Serb, for God's sake. And, you know, I was in my 40s and she was in her 70s, and, you know, we're both strong-minded women. And I had to give more often than she did. But, and yes, it's just her, you know, just not being able to do what I wanted to do. And I felt like I was wasting time. And as it turned out, we did waste a lot of time because we couldn't do more, because she just wanted to visit so and have another shot of rakia, more brandy, another Turkish coffee. You know, I'll just have some more lunch. You know,
we should really be drinking brandy right now, because that's another. I mean, everywhere you go, if they're not stuffing food down you, they are going, try our plum brandy, which. Did you already have a toast for it, or did you develop one along the way?
Oh no, I was brought up on it. I mean, I didn't like it when I was a kid. It was like, oh god, it was really strong. But as you get older, you know, your palate widens. And oh no, I mean, believe me, I had plenty of rakia of all sorts, and yeah, it's just part of the culture. You know, the same thing in. You know, you have that in Italy, or you know, they give you a grappa or nocino or something. We have our own version of nocino with walnut brandy, and it's just such a, you know, basic part of the culture. You come in, sit down, have a shot of rakia, have a cup of coffee, and it's just everyone does it. But yes,
repeat 5 times a day.
Yes. Unless you're driving. And you can't have any.
Yeah, are you allowed to say no? It sounds as if it's quite difficult to refuse. Certainly the food.
I could, yes. I had to be firm, because there was no way I was having even a single tot and tackling those mountain roads in a hire car with my mother. No, I could wait till we got back to my uncle's house. I made up for it. But no, it's not a. It's not an easy. It wasn't an easy time of it, really.
Yeah. Is that partly why the book was sort of aborted at that stage? You just couldn't find a way to do it that would actually, you know,
Absolutely.
work as a book. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Because I had actually done it. I started with that trip, and then 2 years later, my husband and I then came back. And that's we did there's a couple of episodes where we then fleshed out more of the family history that my mother and I didn't do. And I, even with those 2 visits, And I wrote about 25,000 words at that time. And I tried flogging. I had met an agent who was interested, but it was during the financial crisis, and she didn't have much hope. And then looking at it later, I thought I could see why she wouldn't. I mean, she really loved the writing and loved the stories, but there wasn't enough there. And it was only, I then sat on it for 10 years. And it was only when I happened to meet Tom Cole, who became my agent, at an authors club, at the authors club party, summer party, whenever it was, and chatting about Lika, chatting about Croatia, and all of my visits. And then he thought, I've since been back there 3 or 4 times, and actually looking back at the very first visit, I had enough. We both agreed, oh, you've actually got a book now. And that's when I then started developing all the different sections and structuring it that way. And it seemed to make perfect sense to do it purely chronologically, and just see how each time the region changed, the country changed, and changed names, how I changed and how my companions were different, and different reactions and different approaches to each visit.
I mean, it is a family story, so in the sense that people with families can relate to a lot of it. You know, you don't have to know the area or be from the area or know much about the history. But in terms of the recent history, which your family, there's tragedy in your family for sure. You were talking about asking the elders and pumping them for their stories, but did they want to tell you certain things? Were there any things that were off limits or things that were too painful to go through?
Yes, there were. I think by that point, when we were there in 2004, which was like only 9 years, and some had just returned from, living in London, or living in Britain, or living in Zagreb, or living in Belgrade, or living in Canada, or wherever for a while, and there was just this. It wasn't a sort of anger. It was. They just didn't really want to go on about it anymore. Yes, it would have been great if I'd spent more time with them rather than being parachuted in. Tell me your stories and then going off again. There was a certain amount of tact that needed to be deployed, which is why I was able to get some stories. And my mother she'd heard some of them before as well, so she wasn't able to tell me what her cousins had told her, because I didn't really feel like I could sit there, whip up the dictaphone and say, "Tell me your story." I'd found some archives of refugee stories done literally just after Operation Storm in 1995, when Croatian forces essentially brought the war to an end in Croatia. And those stories were able to give me a lot of background and a lot more of a sense of what it was like in a more general level. But the family, they were just like, yeah, it was really, really, really hard time. And sit down, have some food, Sit down and eat.
Is it your great grandmother who was killed, basically?
Yes, it was. It was my mother's grandmother. That was one of the most harrowing parts of the book, really. It was just very briefly, the 1941, when Hitler declared war on Yugoslavia, and at that time there was a fascist puppet state, Nazi puppet state set up in Croatia itself, and the Ustaša, and they set about murdering Serbs. They were the first on the list, and also Jews and Roma and anyone else who essentially disagreed with them. And they did it in such brutal ways that even the local Nazi commanders were a little bit like, could you rein it in a bit? They were really extraordinarily, unspeakably brutal. And they would round up whole villages and throw them into pits and shoot them and bury them alive. And that's what happened to my great grandmother. She was taken from her village and marched through a wood, and in the pouring rain, and all of them rifle butt in the back of the head, thrown into a pit, and shot at, and then left to die. She was smothered by all the bodies landing on top of her, but my aunt, my mother's first cousin, was with her, and she was the only one to survive. She was 19 at the time, and lay under these bodies in this pit for 10 days, I think, before she was able to crawl out, because the Ustasha kept coming back and, throwing some more random shot, firing more shots into the pit and throwing lime as well, and scalding the skin. And, if anyone asked for water, if everyone but dared to say anything, they'd be shot. So it was quite, yes, it was horrendous.
Mm. And there are sort of recent scars. Another theme is as you're going around trying to find houses, churches, settlements, villages. But there've been more recent kind of, people being chased out of their homes or their homes being burnt. How much history how did you work out about the history? It's not a book of history, but you have to deal with it at some level in this book, don't you? Was it very much how you yourself approached the history and learned about it?
I've read so much. The research I did on this book was huge. Having said that, there aren't as many books as you think about, as you would think about the history of that. And because of when the war started, the whole 90s war, and we did have people like Alan Little, the death of Yugoslavia, and he and Laura Silver from the New York Financial Times had done a book to go with the series. And so there was an awful lot of very good reporting. Misha Glenny, of course, did a lot of writing on it. And Tim Judah. I mean, there are a lot of really good reporting on it. And the thing that I had to very much keep the forefront of my mind is that when Serbs and Croats in Croatia became enemies, and when you don't want to say both sides, because that diminishes what the other side had gone through, but I did have to make it very, very clear that Serbs had done horrible things to Croats and Croats had done horrible things to Serbs. And I had to make it very clear where and when that had happened and why certain things were happening because of the Serbs' actions or the Croats' actions. And I had to balance it, because there are an awful lot of revisionists going on around, and especially a lot of nationalism, both amongst Serbs and amongst Croats. A lot of Serbs would like to diminish what their side had done at the time, and same with the Croats. I mean, the Croats are revising Second World War history with the Ustasha, I'd say, a tiny number of them. But unfortunately, nationalism does get in the way. And the thing that I found really quite that meant a lot to me was when my editor was going through my manuscript, and he was reading. That came to a part of that when I was explaining the war, and he said, "How you've described it was balanced and accessible and compassionate." And I was thrilled to hear that, because it really was. I mean, I put so much work into that, because my family's Serbian, and Serbs had done horrible, horrible things, and I didn't want to whitewash that in any way. I also had to be clear that Croatians, who I go there, several times a year, be going there so many times over the decades, absolutely love the place, love the people. They did horrible things, and a lot of tourists go somewhere, have absolutely no idea the context at all, and they'll see ruins of houses, and a lot of the ruins are because of 2-3 things. One of them obviously was the 90s war, and also just emigration. And that is still going on. A lot of the younger generation of Croats they've been leaving Croatia in droves, and they'd be going Germany, Austria, bit in London, not so much now because of Brexit. Load in Dublin, large Croatian community in Dublin, yeah. And so you see all these empty houses, and you will see ones that obviously that had been bombed, had mortar shells and graffiti and what have you. But it's important to have an idea of the landscape, an explanation of what the landscape that you're looking at and why it is as it is, rather than just looking at something going, oh, that's rather beautiful. And then you look at this house and you think, what's, and not ignoring it, but also just being fully aware of what you're looking at.
Yeah, it seems that you put in just enough for context without it overbalancing the book and your experiences going through of what it's like now and what people are like now. Was there a kind of, I mean, what does it feel like now that there is a bit in the book where there's a kind of trouble with license plates on cars? You know, if you have a Belgrade license plate and you were hiring cars, you know, I just wondered if a visitor might get in trouble because they just had the wrong kind of license plate. Is it like that?
Yeah, I think it might be. I think it's diminishing by now. But when I was there in 2009 with a car hired in Serbia with Belgrade plates, and that's when it was telling me, be careful where you park it. Be discreet where you go. Don't go to certain places with a Belgrade car, and because you will have things thrown at the windscreen, tires slashed, and people were doing that. They wouldn't have told me otherwise because people did know. And I did actually read then the story of a pensioner in Istria who had been fined. I think he was sent to jail, maybe just heavily fined for doing exactly that. You know, so it had been done, and. Which is why the subsequent trips that we did, we started in Budapest, so we had Hungarian plates.
Bit easier.
Absolutely, yeah. And then the last time we were there, we had Slovenian plates, and then this time, you know, we did a road trip, month-long road trip, 3.5 weeks, going into Croatia and all around, and of course we had a British car. Which puzzled quite a few people.
Yes, well, you rock up and start sort of speaking the language, and people are a bit surprised that you're able to, rocking up in your British car. And I mean, in terms of the language, I remember when Serbo-Croat used to almost be a jokey thing. Like you'd say something like, I couldn't understand a word of what went on. It might as well have been in Serbo-Croat. But what is Serbo-Croat? Is it two different dialects? Or
no. It was sort of lumped together. Essentially, it's rather like, I think it's even closer than US and British English.
Right.
It's the languages are so similar. You do have a lot of differences, and some things in pronunciation as well. In Croatian, you'll have an extra sort of vowel sound in that you won't have the Serbian version, like in Serbian reka, or in Croatian rijeka. So little things like that. You know what the word is, but slight difference in pronunciation.
Yeah.
And I mean, in Croatia, they have different words for the months of the year, whereas in Serbian they use the Latin ones, and the Croatians are rather like other Slavic languages like Czech and I think Polish as well, where they use it by the season. So one is the month of harvesting, the month of sowing, you know, all that sort of thing. And also when Croatia did declare independence, like a lot of new countries, they immediately found ways of showing how they were different. And there was one period, which they since calmed down, but at the time, they would deliberately come up with new words. Rather than, you know, calling a belt like a kaish, they called it thing that goes around your waist and to hold up your trousers. They were doing it deliberately, just to say, oh, we have different language in the Serbs, we're not the same as they are. That's long gone now, luckily. But you know, we have different words for bread, which is unusual, and it's the languages. There's no way that a Serb and a Croat cannot understand each other, and a Bosnian as well. And in Montenegrin, those four ex-republics of Yugoslavia, they all have 85%, 95% the same language, and it's only Slovenian and Macedonian and of course Kosovo now, because Kosovo are declared independent, so that's Albanian. But Macedonia, very different language, and Slovenia, very different language. And even people who, actually, I've met Slovenians and Macedonians who all speak Serbian because they were taught that in school.
Right. Yeah.
And it's still being taught, and it's quite gratifying for me to go there, and they actually make the effort to speak Serbian because they know that no one's going to speak Slovenian or Macedonian.
What's the literature like, and do you read Serbian novels and things?
Only in translation. Only in translation.
Right.
Unfortunately, my language isn't good enough, and there aren't enough. But writers in the Balkans are beginning to get more attention. In publishers like Istros books, for example, they're doing a lot more Balkans writing in translation, and the literature is, from what I've read, I mean, it's very, very different, very different sensibility. It's you've got this past that you can either allow to weigh heavily, or you just deal with it in a certain way. And also the humor is quite different. It's very dark in a lot of jokes, deliberately very, very dark.
So your dad just got the hell out, basically, didn't he? He went off to Canada. Canada?
Eventually he ended up in a refugee camp in Italy, and then in Germany, which is where the photograph in the book, the colour plate was taken, and then in London.
Right.
And he lived in London for about 8 years, I think, and then he went off to Canada. And
kind of never came back. Didn't go back to the homeland.
No, he never did. He never did.
No interest.
And because he was very anti-Tito, anti-communist, and he wouldn't want to go back. And it's sad because obviously he never saw his family again. I mean, his father died young. His father died in 1933, and his closest sister moved off to Wisconsin, so he visited her quite often. But he had a brother in Wales, and who hadn't seen since he left Britain in 1955. And they were actually going to get together, but my uncle in Wales died in the 80s, early 80s, my dad in the late 80s. And splintered families everywhere.
And that meant you were brought up in Canada and born in Canada, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
So what are your feelings about Canada now? Because, I mean, your mum still lives there. Is that
yes, she does.
Right?
Yes.
There,
yeah. She's in a care
Toronto.
Home. Yeah. Well, no, actually in Hamilton now. Yeah, she's in a care home there. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you go there I mean, you must have travelled everywhere.
But
do you write about Canada as well?
I do. Yeah. But I've only been to Ontario and Quebec.
Right.
That's it. I haven't been anywhere else. I mean, Canada's huge, second largest country in the world. It is enormous. But I relatively speaking, in percentage-wise, I've seen a tiny fraction of Canada compared with, say, Croatia, or France, or Italy, or Britain. And it's just so bloody huge. I would like to. I really would like to. There are times when it just gets too expensive. And we did actually go to see my mother literally a month before COVID hit, before the pandemic hit. And that's when we realised she had to get into a care home. And then I went to see her again November before last, because we couldn't go. We just, and even it was COVID tests and masks, and she's in a nursing home, so we had to get tested every day, and all that sort of thing. Limited time with her, but no, I did do some travel things on especially on Toronto, because Toronto is absolutely fantastic, brilliant city. It's always fun to go back. Wouldn't want to live there again, but it just I hadn't lived there since about 35 years ago. But it's great fun to visit, it really is. But
do you, apart from Croatia, is there any area that you specialise in as a travel writer, or do you just go where you're sent?
Oh no, I do. I mean, obviously, Yeah, no, I mean Serbia. I spent a lot of time in Serbia over the years. I went to Belgrade every year for years until the pandemic, and then managed to go back once, I think last year. And essentially, yeah. And I also like Bosnia and Montenegro. I love those places. But the other two countries I go to a lot are France and Italy. I've been. I think probably spent more time in France than I have anywhere else over the decades. I know it really, really well. I absolutely love it. And I did French at university as well. So at least my French is so much better than my Serbian.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, that helps. It always helps to speak the language a bit. I wanted to go into the food aspect because certainly if you're not a vegetarian, I think this is a sort of lip-smacking read. You are constantly finding wonderful things to eat. And things seem to have just come straight out of the garden, or, the fish has come out of the lake or the river. Everything is super fresh. Is there a dish that is so typically from the region that you sort of lust for it when you're away?
Oh, cevapcici. It's such a basic
cheesy
thing.
dish. Is that
No,
what's...
no, that's
no,
cevapcici.
that's
The
rissoles.
yes, that's right.
Rissoles.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's such a basic thing, but my husband makes them. He makes them really, really well. In fact, we're going to have some. We've got them in the freezer. We're making barbecue tomorrow. But it's just the flavour of it and just the memory of eating it so many places, so many different types of places, and then you have it in this fluffy flatbread called a lepinja, and then you have ivar, which is it's red pepper and aubergine relish, but you can buy it in Sainsbury's. The Waitrose, it's become quite popular, and bits of chopped onion, put that all together, a little kebab, and it's just gorgeous.
I was going to say, it sounds a bit like a burger and relish,
well, they're like a skinless sausage, things like that sort of size, and you put like 5 of them in the flatbread, and no, it's very Balkan, it's very sort of obviously very Turkish, very Ottoman influence of 500 years of Ottoman rule in the region, and so the cuisine, it really is. It's just the Ottomans coming from the south and the east, and then the Austrians coming from the north. So many Austrian influences as well, and then Italian coming over from Italy into Istria, and you find that so much all around Croatia. Obviously, the coast is Dalmatian is very. A lot of Italian influence because Italy, Venice, they're both ruled Dalmatia at one point.
Yes, if you go along, I've only been along the coast in Croatia, but there are moments where you turn a corner. It's as if you're in a little square in Venice, isn't it? Just from the architecture, the churches, wells, and piazzas.
It is
it's
absolutely
beautiful.
It is that whole. I mean, Dalmatia, and also the same sort of architecture further north. And also, if you go to Rovin in Istria, I mean, I had to double check. I wasn't actually in Venice because it's so Venetian. In fact, we were in Rovin on the road trip, and on the way as we were going back into Italy, I think we had to stop in Venice for lunch because you just spent several days in what had been a mini Venice, and without the canals. But the architecture is exactly the same. But all the ones in Dalmatia is that beautiful, that the white, the sort of creamy stone with the terracotta rooftops and the dark green shutters everywhere. And it has a sort of, and then the water in front of it, which is so clear, because it's mainly pebbles. So you've got it's a clearer water than you would have with a sandy beach, for example. And everything is just so vivid. The colours. Oh God, I'm just swooning at the thought of it. It is. There was the Venetians left a big legacy behind. In all those, you go to Korčula or you go to Hvar, and it's that sort of, it's not uniform, but it has a similar that similar sort of architecture, and it's quite exquisite.
There is another theme in the book that you like to plunge into water whenever you can. And I was quite struck at one point, you say something like, I was desperate for the sea. So even though Lika is inland, it's very beautiful. It does, there is a sense that sometimes you just have to head for the Adriatic and enjoy the sea. And there's another quite funny thing where you say wild swimming, or as we always used to call it, swimming. That's so true, isn't it? Why is it wild swimming? I don't.
Well, also, at least the rivers in Lika, I mean, they are so clear. I mean, incredibly clear. And of course, they haven't got raw sewage being dumped in them either, which is another thing. And but yes, the rivers in Lika, anywhere that you can have any sort of place that you can get into the water, either they'll have like a rock that they turn into a dock, or a little sandy bit that they might have created, they'll turn into a beach, because they are quite far from the coast. But they do make use of make use of the rivers. But yeah, there are times when you just want to be in the Adriatic. You want the salt in your skin. You want that really impossibly clear water with the pebbles that you could just see and just plunge. Yes, but it's the swimming, the water, this everything, just being in the water there. I can't get enough of it.
Yeah, I think being in the water and then having your rissoles and looking at the sunset, that's sort of pretty idyllic. I mean, there's another strand in it where you seem to be quite exhausted, and I don't know whether it was your mum exhausting you or all the driving was exhausting you, but sometimes you just have to flop, don't you, and just lie in a chair.
Oh God, yes, that was, oh blimey, yes, because I think I'd come down with a cold. My back was hurting me. My mother was playing silly buggers, and I just had enough, and they were going to go off and do something. Just go away, just leave me alone. I had the most idyllic few hours on my own, just lying in the sun and listening to my iPod. We still had iPods in those days, and just lying in the orchard beside me, and just the lovely greenery around me, and just relaxing. And also, talking about needing to be near the sea, and we did have my husband and I had a couple of days in this tiny fishing village called Posidaria, which is on the way to Zadar, which is where I was when I was a child. My cousin had taken me for my first taste of the Adriatic, and that's when I was saying we were in Leek, and I was we'd had an idyllic few days there, but just really needed to be in the sea. And the simplest little village, the simplest hotel. Really, everything very, very basic. But it was exactly what I needed. It was just, jumping into that water, swimming around the rocks, lying on again, they created not a beach, but, bathing platform, and sun lounges, and just lying there, getting fresh tomatoes from old lady selling on a little stall in the street, and having a, makeshift picnic on our balcony, watching the sun go down, drinking very cheap Vranets, cheap red wine, and from these big litre bottles that cost about €4 or something.
But you've also been to the other extreme, obviously, with your travel writing hat on. You must have done the luxury end as well, even though it might be not what you prefer, but at the same time you can't be too ungrateful, really, can you, when you're living in the lap of luxury? But tell us about what's the most luxe thing that you've covered.
I've done a couple of them. One was this year. I was in if you go to Hvar, there's a little archipelago called the Pakleni Islands, and one of them was Parmigiana, and there's a hotel called Zori Timeless Hotel, and it had been a restaurant since just after the Second World War, and it's only now become an ultra luxurious hotel. But there are only 4 residences, and each one has its own little plunge pool, but everything about it. I mean, the family running it, absolutely adorable. Everyone is just such a fun bunch of people. They'd all been working in the restaurant for years, but it was like €2,000 a night, but you'd had a beautiful room, and then you'd had an enormous, it's like an outdoor living room, really, with more sofas and tables and hammocks, and we had a whirlpool, and we had a plunge pool, and then you had the sea, and the sea was right there, palm trees and sea, and that place was so laid back, incredibly expensive, and really, I mean, but the restaurant was beautiful. Again, I wouldn't have been able to afford, 55 euros for a plate of food. Sadly, I don't make that much money. But it was wonderful to experience it, and I'm extremely lucky that I get invited to do those sort of things. And if I had the money, I'd cheerfully go back like a shot, because it really was a very special place. The atmosphere about it was everything was really sort of laid back and relaxed, in that sort of old Dalmatian summertime. Although it was spring when I was there, but it had that really laid back feeling. It's just like, yeah, just lie in the hammock and look at the sea for a bit. Then go have another lovely meal.
Yeah. I mean, when you're doing something like that, is there much to write about?
Oh yeah, well, there is, absolutely. I mean, it was unfortunately. I'm still recovering from a ski accident, so my knee's still out of whack. And there would have been a lot of nice hiking around, but I couldn't handle the terrain. And and then you take boat trips around to other little bits, and you just jump off and swim. Because it was April, it was too early in the season for that, so I was more like doing a recce more than anything else.
Yeah.
And then you get the boat, you go to Hvar, and there's Hvar town is beautiful. Out of season, it's great. You can then really enjoy the history of the place. In high season, it's full of very drunken people, mainly Brits, and it's heaving, and they had to bring in all these fines for, like, don't walk down the street in the bikini. Please don't vomit on this bench. Don't fall asleep on this bench. Don't fall asleep on the beach, because that's what people are doing. Unfortunately, yes.
Brits abroad.
I know. And but so there are stories, and also the people stories, and development of tourism around the other islands, the next island in that archipelago. They've got that's where this very famous beach club, Carpe Diem, is, and they boats come back and forth between Hvar town and this particular beach. 24 hours a day, practically. I mean, they're just, partying till 5 o'clock in the morning. And at the other end of the island, there's a really lovely, beautiful, quiet little beach house, this little villa called Robinson, which is, they've been Robinson tourism, they call it. Which is
Robinson Crusoe.
Absolutely, where they build these places, these villas or these houses, these little shacks, and where essentially you get away from it all, the way that Robinson Crusoe did. Only you go there deliberately, and that has really. I've seen that word a lot in the past 15 years, and it's become a big thing in Croatia. And so you see at Robinson, and either sometimes with an S or with a Z. And then that's a sort of vibe that they're trying to create. Just come here, switch off, and just chill out. Away from people.
Are you fairly low maintenance when it comes to these trips? Can you pretty much rough it? Just you don't need to be pampered. Presumably, as a travel writer, you've just got to take things as they come.
I do. The only difference of this year, I found it difficult getting on and off boats. Because of my knee,
right.
And it sort of gave me an insight into people who do have permanent problems with, with walking, any sort of mobility, how they could find it difficult to travel. So I have had to make, certain requests about, because I can't walk doing this sort of thing. But generally, no, I'm perfectly fine. I think the only thing that does bother me is if you can't get any sort of, there's like a tiny. The shower there's like a tiny trickle that can get a little bit annoying. But no, that I don't mind roughing it. And I'm not one of these. I've heard stories about travel writers being prima donnas and demanding this, that, and the other. I have actually been given the worst room at a hotel before.
Yes.
And I've been given where I travel with clothes pegs, because so many curtains don't close in the middle. I've been in places where you open the door handle and it comes off in your hand and things like that, and that's when you think, okay, management, you might want to do something about this. But it's when hoteliers essentially get away with what they can.
Yeah.
And offering really, really substandard places for an awful lot of money. But generally, I mean, on this trip we did, in this road trip, we had a night in Italy, in Lake Iseo, a village I just happened to pick at random, found a one-star hotel, really basic room, actually, really basic. But it had a really good fan, really hot night. But the balcony looked out over Lake Uzeo, and we had the sunset, and it was the most beautiful view you can imagine. Like €90 a night, brilliant. Didn't mind that. And on the same trip, we had luxury stays as well as same trip. So I was as happy in that 1-star hotel having that view as I was in a €2,000 a night place.
Yes, I
Not for the
interviewed.
bathroom.
I interviewed Sarah Wheeler. This was on stage. She loves trains. I suppose we're all different in a way. She just loves hopping on a train, and some of the descriptions of train journeys that she makes, that it sounds like hell on earth or hell on wheels.
Yes.
Going across Russia with people who keep you up all night.
I think other
she
people
loves it. She loves it.
Yeah, I know. So I remember reading one show, Around the World in 80 Trains. She wrote that book, which I absolutely loved it. But there are times I'm thinking, it's not you could put up with a board that you're lying on for a bunk bed in a sleeper train, or really horrible. I did a 10.5-hour journey from Montenegro to Belgrade on the really ancient train, and it was the most basic thing you can imagine. And the toilets were absolutely shocking. There was no dining car, but I said next time bring wet wipes. But I absolutely loved the journey, because we had a car of a car, what I think, it's 3 and 3 facing each other, all other, locals and whatever, and we brought tons of food, we all sharing food and having a nice chat with her, looking at the scenery, fantastic scenery, mountains going through Montenegro, and it was a fantastic journey, and it cost €10. But I think it's the other people that can be, if you're in a sleeper train and you're sharing it with, flatulent, noisy people who are arguing all night, and I wouldn't. I'm not sure I could. I think I would want to have a private sleeping car.
Yeah, at least you can retreat at the end of the day. So, wet wipes, clothes pegs, 2 very good travellers' tips there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're getting the insider info today.
Also, sometimes blue tack is quite good. I also bring Post-it notes to stick over any sort of light fitting that glows in the dark.
That's going to kind of blink at you all night. Yeah,
right in the line of sight. It's like hoteliers, spend the night in your own bed, then in your own room, then you'll know what it's like.
Yeah, there's always something where you're getting to sleep and there's a light that's sort of right there, or on the ceiling. Somewhere I was recently, there was a kind of weird, intermittently blinking light.
Smoke alarm.
Every time you thought it had stopped, it would sort of, oh God, there it goes again. Yeah, maddening. So blue tack, Post-it notes. Very good. All close pegs, all good things. Let us finish with our 3 questions that I'm asking everybody. And people seem to struggle with pinning down a favourite artwork, but I sent you the questions ahead of time. Have you managed to come up with a favourite artwork you'd like to talk about?
Yes, but I'm going to cheat on this one. I'm going to choose a favourite recent artwork.
Yeah,
which is what I happened to see last year. We were in Manchester. I went up to the Lowry Gallery in Salford, and hadn't been before. And there's a painting called "Man Lying on the Wall."
Who's it by?
Lowry.
It is by Lowry.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, all the works are his. And it's a man lying on a brick wall, and there's a church spire behind him, and there's a chimney stack with smoke blowing. It's Manchester.
The chimney stack.
And then on the ground in front of the wall, there's a briefcase, and Lowry actually put his own initials on that, so it says LSL, and an umbrella stacked against the wall, and the man, beautifully dressed, properly well dressed, lying on the thingy, smoking a cigarette, just doing that. And I thought, I love this painting. Absolutely loved it. Hadn't seen it before. And it's called Man Lying on the Wall, 1957. I really like that. Very good. Hadn't seen that. That's a really good collection of Lowry. If you happen to be in Manchester, definitely worth seeing.
Yeah, I saw some very interesting Lowrys in a private collection, but given that they are, given what they're about, mills and ordinary people, it seemed rather sad to have these things on a wall in somebody's fancy house. You know what I mean? They're real. It's real art of the people. I know nothing about Lowry as a person, but.
If you do happen to go up, if you do happen to be up there, definitely
worth a visit. Worth a visit.
You'll learn so much and see so many more sides to him and his background and his art. I didn't. I just knew the sort of the famous ones, and a lot more to him.
Were you writing about Manchester?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, this is the good thing about travel writing. I mean, you can't sit in a deck chair all day or stay in your hotel suite all day. Now, however lovely it is, you do have to go out and find things, but make all these wonderful discoveries along the way.
Mm-hmm. Very lucky.
I'm calling this the Book of Shame, but I don't necessarily want to shame people or feel that people should be shamed. But is there a book that you sort of think you should have read by now?
Yes. Yes, I can't believe I haven't actually read 1984.
Wow. Okay.
I know. I've read a load of his other books. I've seen the film, and but I haven't actually got around to reading it, and I think I must do at some point pretty soon.
I think it is one of those books that it's so seeped into the world. That you almost feel like you have read it. It will be interesting to read because I'm sure you have an idea of it, especially having seen films. So it may really surprise you when you read the actual. It's quite short, from what, not as short as Animal Farm, but you can do it in a good session, and then maybe have some bracing brandy, get some plum brandy to sort of have a stiffener at the end of it, because it would be very interesting to see what you think about that. A friend of mine she finally saw Spinal Tap, the movie This Is Spinal Tap, and she just said, so that's why people have been saying one louder. That's why people have been saying you can't dust for vomit. That's why people have been saying this one goes up to 11.
I love that movie, and I've seen it so many times, but actually I hadn't seen it for about 15 years and watched it again, I think within the past year. And both my husband and I, we were just on the floor. So we'd just forgotten how many catchphrases there are.
How many of those died in a bizarre gardening accident? So she'd heard all these like forever and just thought that's a very weird saying, and realised they were all in this film. So probably 1984 will have loads of things. Oh, that's where that comes from, you know. Obviously Big Brother, but lots of other stuff as well. Finally, have you ever had any bizarre feedback or funny feedback? I'm immediately thinking about maybe hoteliers or tourist boards getting back in touch, but I mean, it can be anything. It can be a review or any sort of feedback.
Oh right, okay. A couple. Well, actually, I thought you were thinking about just about the book.
Can be anything, can be any aspect of your work, really.
There's a story that I quite forgot about until just now, which it's one of these. It's a very important lesson for travel writers who go to places, make assumptions, and then write about them, thinking, "Oh, I'm so clever. I've sussed this one out." And the first time I went to Montenegro was, 12 years ago. I was on a walking holiday. I was writing about it for, I think, The Independent, actually. And everywhere you go in Montenegro, everyone, they were all very sweet and lovely. I spoke the language, but they were all very, come in, have a drink, have a coffee, really, really friendly people. Everybody was uniformly friendly. Even the policemen were friendly. And it was only one day that we went to, we were in a small group, and we went to this restaurant, which obviously is on the tourist coach trail. And we went in there and ordering coffee, and I was speaking, Montenegrin to the owner, and and he was completely morose. And he was the first person who didn't ask me, "Oh, so where are you from then? Why are you speaking our language?" Because I grew up surrounded by other English people. And I thought, that's very odd, and very, very odd. And then I happened to mention the piece, along the lines of, "Oh, such a friendly nation, a bit of a, I'm, a sort of morose person in this cafe sort of thing," along those lines. I then get an email saying, "We're very sorry that you," obviously they read the piece, "very sorry that you," this is really embarrassing actually, "very sorry that you had such an unfriendly experience in our cafe, but the owner had just learnt that his son had been in a car accident and his son was in hospital." Bloody hell. Never, ever, ever do anything as stupid and as high-minded and just thoughtless as that ever again. And I've learned my lesson not to make these really, really glib
sweeping kind of judgments.
Absolutely.
And
you just you don't know.
Yeah, that's very good advice. You must have felt bad after that.
I was mortified, absolutely. And of course, I sent an email back saying, just groveling apology. As I'm so sorry. I just don't do that sort of thing again.
And there's the other funny thing in the book, talking about feedback, when you're asked what's your favourite beach, and you go for a really, off the beaten track. Nobody knows about this beach, but it's fantastic. And then somebody gets in touch and they can't believe that you weren't paid to say so. Who paid you? How?
That's right. Yes, I was at the beach at the Posta d'Adia place I told you about.
Right.
So we had to have that that the very simple holiday there. Yeah, and the local radio reporter, she emailed me and actually I think we talked on the phone because we did a phone interview, and yeah, she said so because I mentioned you have to, it was the usual thing, a beach and then place to stay, and I mentioned the hotel that we stayed in, and a few years after we'd been there, and she said that, so the hotel, did they pay you to feature in the place? I said, no, they didn't pay me. They didn't even, I was there like a year ago, whatever, and I wasn't there. I was there on holiday. I was paying for the hotel. So did they ask you to be in the piece? They didn't know. No, I wrote it a year after I was in the hotel, for God's sake. I just wouldn't believe me. So who's choosing your beaches? I'm choosing the beaches, for God's sake.
Yeah.
I'm writing what I want to write, and
yes,
it was a left field thingy, but again, it was one of those lovely memories. And a lot of these places they hold great memories, and anybody going there would have a lovely swim, nice place, nice hotel. It's not like going to Hvad or the really famous ones, anywhere in Dubrovnik or whatever. Nothing like that. Very, very simple, but I liked it.
I think, sometimes people overthink this stuff. That I've had this in journalism as well. When I was a lit ed, you're only doing the books where the publishers have bought advertising. I bet you own, and it's like, I wish they would buy advertising. That would be great. But there is no connection. And with sometimes people, if they don't want to believe it, they won't believe it. And it doesn't really matter what you say. So
I know.
Anyway, well, it's been lovely talking to you, Mary. And we've been talking about this book, My Family and Other Enemies. It's a really good fun for people who have families, for people who like travel, for people who like wild swimming, eating, drinking. It has huge appeal, and it is published by Brant Guides, travel specialist, Brat. I'm not good on pronunciation, but yeah, travel publications. So yeah, very much recommended. It's very good fun, and thank you very much for joining me in the book bag. Cheers, Mary.
Thank you so much, Suzi. Thanks.
And thank you, everybody who is tuning in, listening to this. Please do remember to like and subscribe. Furthermore, apparently, if you, I don't know how this works, but if you click on all, you will here you will get updates about all the new interviews that I'm going to do. So, help us out here, like and subscribe, and we'll carry on bringing really interesting writers to you every single week. Thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.